Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. Welcome to this live stream on French philosopher of the 20th century, Paul Ricoeur, as a thorn in the side of phenomenology. And I want to talk about what I mean by that, a thorn in the side of phenomenology. Paul Ricoeur, something quite different going on in his phenomenology than we see in Husserl, Heidegger, Jean-Luc Marion. And I want to really get into the thought world of Paul Ricoeur and what he's up to in terms of hermeneutics, with an emphasis on interpretation of the phenomenon. So we already see this in Heidegger's philosophy of the self showing of being across the horizon of interpretation, the Umwelt, and how the human subject appropriates uh, every phenomenon in some way contributing to the self-revelation of Sein or being. And so it's this attentiveness to horizon, of milieu, of context, that Ricoeur really brings his best thought. So Paul Ricoeur, a philosopher of the 20th century, born in 1913, the same year Husserl published Ideas 1, and Ricoeur eventually would translate that work of Husserl from German to French. Ricoeur studied philosophy. He was precocious as a young person and a budding intellectual. He was influenced by Gabriel Marcel. He served in the French military and was a prisoner of war from 1940 to 1945. The same years, Levinas also was a prisoner of war. Paul Ricoeur continued to develop intellectually as a prisoner of war, and he studied the work of Karl Jaspers, for instance, and continued to think not only in terms of existentialism, but also in terms of phenomenology, and especially what will be called hermeneutical phenomenology. So we could see Ricoeur's phenomenology as even a different brand than that of Husserl, Heidegger, and Marion, Merleau-Ponty. It's something else going on here. So I want to take some excerpts from my 2017 book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist, an Etude in Phenomenology, which features the work of Jean-Luc Marion, Paul Ricoeur, and Emmanuel Levinas approaching religious experience, approaching the Eucharist, which is a religious phenomenon within Catholicism, above all, and using these three thinkers who are not all Catholics. Only Marion is the Catholic, Ricoeur is a Reformed Christian or Calvinist Protestant, and Levinas Jewish, and combining forces to approach this religious phenomenon. But to do so, I first really think along with each one and consider how do they go about phenomenology. So in this live stream, I simply want to talk about Ricoeur and how he goes about phenomenology. So from chapter 3 of this book, really get into Ricoeur's thought as a thinker of proclamation and attestation, is what I call him, in contrast to Jean-Luc Marion, who I position as a thinker of manifestation and adoration. So Paul Ricoeur could be described aptly as a thorn in the side of phenomenology insofar as he levels the bastions of phenomenological idealism and objective purity in the name of hermeneutics. So hermeneutics comes from a Greek word that means interpretation, or the art of interpretation. So phenomenological givenness is one thing, but the subjective uptake of that givenness is another. So we're asking with Ricoeur, what is this relationship between the given phenomenon and my reception of it, ultimately my interpretation of it? So one could go so far as to say that Ricoeur appears as an altruistic deconstructionist of phenomenological certainty and confidence that we have gotten back to the things themselves with Husserl, that we have this wide open field of perception for things in themselves as they give themselves by themselves. But for Ricoeur, universal claims are arrived at only by way of the particular. Better put, the universal is held in perpetual suspense according to the ever unfolding hermeneutics of the particular. So, this is a couple key concepts for philosophy: the relationship between the universal and the particular. And Husserl is driving toward universal givenness, the immanent data for consciousness that have a universal bearing. But Ricoeur is saying we still are dealing with individuated, distinct phenomena as they give themselves in their unique particularity. So, how do we reconcile the particularity of each and every phenomena and the human subject's interpretation of each and every phenomena with the universality of givenness as a key concept for phenomenology? So, we want to reflect on Ricoeur's thought in four ways. First, how Ricoeur levels um, Husserlian idealism, the critique he levels at Husserlian idealism. Second, Ricoeur's conception of the symbol and metaphor as hermeneutics to the invisible or the absolute. Third, we want to think about the place of kerygma or proclamation within Ricoeur's work. And four, we want to think about the function of attestation in or testimony in Ricoeur's ethical paradigm. So we want to think altogether about Ricoeur's reformed and revised phenomenological proposal. Ricoeur has been earmarked as one of the pivotal proponents of the linguistic turn in the history of philosophy, attentiveness to language and the function of language within philosophy. We see this in several other thinkers like Gadamer, Wittgenstein, thinking of Wittgenstein's language games, and a real attentiveness to the function of language within philosophy. Ricoeur pays careful attention to the function of language and interpretation in all philosophical methods, especially in the method of phenomenology. He always seems to choose the long route in attempting to answer any question set before him. And what's meant by the long route, all these various detours, consists in whatever is necessary to arrive at the most adequate, but never entirely definitive responses to a pressing question for philosophical inquiry. So Ricoeur is a great example of a philosopher who allows the questions to lead his thinking, always allowing the questions to lead his thinking to new caverns to explore, new territories, detours. I just love this about Paul Ricoeur, the way he thinks. When you look at his writing, you look at his different books, getting into psychoanalysis, for example, it's just so interesting that he's willing to patiently explore all these various questions. And so he chooses the long route every time. Ricoeur does not mandate that theology be bracketed from critical philosophical inquiry, but again, like Jean-Luc Marion sees a continuity of reason operating in each realm in philosophy and theology with the same rigor. So here's a quote from Ricoeur's book, Conflict of Interpretations. And the title is worth the price of admission. Paul Ricoeur, thinking about the conflict of interpretations, not as a bad thing, but as necessary to get at the truth of the matter through a conflict of interpretations. This is really rooted in the history and tradition of rabbinic Judaism, first of all, how the rabbis, through this midrash, this process of interpretation that is a communal one, involves a conflict of interpretations. And it's precisely through that conflict of interpretations, that dialectics of thought, that we arrive at the full resonance of truth. Because without the wrestling, there's not the prize, there's not the fruit. So Ricoeur, in his book, The Conflict of Interpretation, says this: the incessant work of philosophical discourse is to put itself into a relation of proximity with charismatic and theological discourse. Why does Ricoeur insist that philosophy needs to put itself in close proximity with theology? Because the stuff of theology, the data, the evidence, the concepts of divinity, the proposals of divine revelation, are precisely what will stretch philosophical thought to new horizons and frontiers that it hasn't been before. Theology serves to expand philosophy. If philosophy insists, with Heidegger and Sartre and others, that we have to proceed with a methodological atheism, we end up with a kind of stagnation of philosophy. Yes, we do end up a room with no exit with Jean-Paul Sartre, for example. But theology blows off the ceiling, and we have an ever unfolding horizon of possibility for thought, and that again is always led by questions, honest questions. So Ricoeur goes on to say, this work of thought is a work that begins by listening. This is key. The work of thought is a work that begins by listening. This is also a very Jewish concept. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, the Shema prayer of Judaism. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. But this Shema, this listen, hear, obey, be obedient to where the questions lead. Listen to the responsorial of the answer that is thick, polyvalent, polyphonic, multifaceted. This is what Ricoeur helps us attend to, that the most important first step of philosophy is to listen to the questions, to approach the answer. And yet within the autonomy of responsible thought. So the autonomy of responsible thought, there's a listening to be done, but a responsibility of each individual philosopher within the community of philosophers. So this is, Paul Ricoeur says, it is an incessant reform of thinking, an incessant, constant, ceaseless, unrelenting reform of thinking. This is Ricoeurian philosophy. Semper reformanda, always in need of reform, of pruning of gathering up the fragments of this philosophical adventure. So there's an incessant reform of thinking, but within the limits of reason alone. So he's very Kantian in this way. I've heard stories of Paul Ricoeur reading the 3 critiques of Kant on the beach. This is the kind of guy he was, that he loved to read, to study every chance he got. So there needs to be a conversion, he says, of the philosopher, as a conversion within philosophy and to philosophy, according to its internal exigencies. what might be some of the internal exigencies of philosophy? To be honest, to be transparent, to be straightforward, to be logical, to be rational, and not to fall into sophism, where we can make any great arguments for any position, but we're after the truth, which always involves the ongoing conversion of any sophist tendencies, we could say, but the need for ongoing conversion within philosophy to philosophy according to its internal exigencies or demands. If there is only one logos, he says, the logos of Christ. Now, we could talk about this more. If there is only one logos, the logos of Christ requires me as a philosopher nothing else than a more complete and more perfect activation of reason. Not more than reason, but whole reason. Let us repeat this phrase, whole reason. So it's kind of shocking, based on what he said up to this last sentence. Why do we have him dropping the name Christ here? In reference to Jesus of Nazareth. Why does he refer to Jesus within his philosophy? It's not just because he was raised in Christianity, but he sees in Christ a connection to the philosophical concept of logos. In the Christian New Testament in Greek, Christ is referred to in the Gospel of John, for example, as the Logos. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Logos as word, Logos as ratio, Logos as reason. And so what Ricoeur is arguing here implicitly is that it is not unreasonable to bring together the logos concept of philosophy and ancient Greek philosophy with the logos concept that he's seeing in Christianity. And how did these mutually inform each other? So he has no problem with this, because what he's after is an expansion of thought and a greater receptivity to truth. And it's reasonable that if we're talking about the self-revelation of truth, that we don't close off to its theological avenues. And theology serves philosophy in this way to cause philosophy to think more than it has thought before. So, in this passage from Ricoeur's Conflict of Interpretations, Ricoeur reveals his fidelity to Kantian thought, religion within the limits of reason alone, a kind of philosophical theology, not theological philosophy, but a philosophical theology. The emphasis is on the philosophy. Ricoeur would be identified as a philosopher rather than a theologian, for example. But for Ricoeur, it's within the Kantian limits of reason that Ricoeur sets out on the long route for developing a critical phenomenological method that recognizes the enmeshment in every phenomenon in a density of texts. This is a beautiful phrase of Ricoeur. Every phenomenon is already enmeshed in a density of text, context, hermeneutical layers, hermeneutical tasks to receive the phenomenon. Because we can talk all we want about the purity of givenness, but we're already making an interpretation through this grammar of phenomenology. So Ricoeur wants us to come clean about the role of hermeneutics in how we do phenomenology. And he gets much of this from Heidegger and the concept of Ereignis, the appropriation of being that involves interpretation. So every phenomenon for Ricoeur is enmeshed in a density of texts. For Ricoeur, as for Marion, philosophy and theology are not mutually exclusive domains, even though they may have distinct discourses. Both fields lay claim to reasonableness, tethered to a principle of coherence, intelligibility, and logic. In a word, logos. So, logos is a very significant concept for Ricoeur. Logos resists all reductionisms and intellectual despondencies. It is always led by questioning, and for questioning, nothing is ever out of bounds. Honest and responsible thinking is ever open to possibility. Any science worthy of the name is open to the data of experience, not just of the experiment that has its parameters, but all experience. To be scientific is to remain open to the possibility of the data and how they might give themselves. So phenomenology is committed to this. And for Ricoeur, whole reason, to think toward the whole, is interdisciplinary in nature. We see this in his work. He's a very interdisciplinary thinker. He's not afraid to dialogue with social and behavioral science, for example. His book on Freud and psychoanalysis, a very thick book. There's so many insights, philosophical insights he's gaining through that dialogue with social and behavioral science. He's not afraid as a philosopher to dialogue with theology, with natural science, with literature, with the arts. Whole reason is interdisciplinary in nature and relies on a logos shared in common for meaning making and truth seeking. This is the vital human task. So the whole concept of the university is founded on this logos principle, that different fields of study can converse with one another by virtue of this common language we call reason. For Ricoeur, the human being is language. And he says language is the medium of our thinking. We don't think, according to Ricoeur, apart from language. It's a very Kantian concept. We don't know or understand without these linguistic structures of thought. Without them, we're a kind of tabula rasa that remains a tabula rasa in the face of phenomenal giving. So hermeneutics is key for Ricoeur. He follows the transcendental aesthetics of Kant and the existential ontology of Heidegger in order to recognize the contextual matrix of phenomenality, the Sitz im Leben of every phenomenon, the setting in life. We could say with Ricoeur, it's very similar to Heidegger's um, this being in the world. There's a context, there's a setting, the Umwelt. Ricoeur is very aware of this. The phenomenological Umwelt for all giving phenomena, all the phenomenological givenness. And the Sitz im Leben is where his attention goes. In his book, Hermeneutics and the Human Sciences, Ricoeur writes, the most fundamental condition of the hermeneutical circle lies in the structure of pre-understanding, which relates all explication to the understanding that precedes and supports it. So let's just take that concept of the hermeneutical circle and the thought of Ricoeur. It's a very important concept. Has very much practical application. So the hermeneutical circle, what does he mean by this? What is it? The hermeneutical circle, we could say, we end where we begin. We come back full circle. And where do we begin? With what Ricoeur calls pre-understanding. So I relate each and every new experience to my point of departure. My point of departure is my pre-understanding, the symbolic order of language and meaning that I bring to every experience. And so, in some ways, I can't peel away from this. But Ricoeur, he says, we're not just stuck in a hermeneutical circle like a hamster in a wheel, but that it's inevitable but reformable through new encounters with new phenomena. And the pre-understanding moves to a kind of uh, post-naivete. Post-naivete. So the hermeneutical circle functions, but it can expand with new experiences and be revised. So this is an important concept for Ricoeur. There is a hermeneutical circle we have to deal with, but we're not trapped within it. If we continue to keep thinking toward the whole, have new dialogues, new conversations, we move from pre-understanding through critique to a post-naivete, which is further understanding. So it's very, it's the essence of critical thinking, like why it's important, why we do it, so that we don't remain trapped in a hermeneutical circle, that we don't remain these autonomous echo chambers to ourselves, that we don't just listen with our own mouths. But as he says, Ricoeur says, the beginning of true philosophy is listening. And listening is led by questions. We inevitably have a pre-understanding. We're going to have a point of departure and a point of arrival very close to that point of departure. But through dialogue, through conversation, through a conflict of interpretations, the hermeneutical circle at least expands, and we are led to deeper understandings. So this is Ricoeur. It's a very helpful takeaway because language itself betrays our pre-understanding with any topic at hand. How we're speaking about it, we're revealing how we already understand it. But are we just about trying to convey our opinions, our doxa in Greek, or are we trying to arrive at real knowledge, episteme, and moreover, truth, aletheia, to use the Greek concepts? Are we just about asserting our own opinion, like a good lawyer who's trying to convince the jury? Or are we really honestly investigating truth and all the risk that we must run to win the prize of truth? So for Ricoeur, philosophy is a gauntlet. Philosophy is a labyrinth. And we have to dare to take the first step inside to slay the Minotaur. Like Theseus, the brave warrior who enters the labyrinth to slay the Minotaur. Do we dare to set out on this adventure of truth? Like Bilbo Baggins at the behest of Gandalf? Do we dare to take leave of the hobbit hole of our pre-understanding? We'll be stuck in that hermeneutic circle as long as we remain in the hobbit hole. But Ricoeur invites us to venture out and take the long route in order to understand like we've never understood before. He's a champion of dialogue and therefore a champion of humanity, a real authentic humanism in which we're not afraid to dialogue with the other, with any other. The religious other, for example, the economic other, the sexual other, the linguistic other, learning new languages as a way to seek that prize of truth and its full resonance. To become a polyglot is part of becoming a philosopher. It takes us out of this hobbit hole of the hermeneutic circle. It expands it. It lets the horizon expand. So Ricoeur goes on to say, in what sense is the development of all understanding and interpretation opposed to the Husserlian project of ultimate foundation? So Ricoeur knows full well that he's bringing about a critique of Husserl with all due appreciation for Husserl, and Ricoeur sees himself still doing phenomenology, but it's expanding the phenomenological project through critique. Critique is necessary for expansion to happen. It's just like a muscle grows by opposing it, by resistance, by lifting the weights, and the muscle breaks down in order to grow. We have so many experiences in life like this, that through the resistance, through the critique, through the interrogation, through the questioning, we arrive at new understandings. This is the only way. Otherwise, we're stuck with what we already have known. And we might be delusional in what we know without exposing our current knowledge to critique through the gauntlet of dialogue and the conflict of interpretations. So Ricoeur asks again, in what sense is the development of all understanding and interpretation opposed to the Husserlian project of ultimate foundation? Essentially, in the sense that all interpretation places the interpreter in medias res, in the middle of everything, and never at the beginning or the end. This is exciting. When I study the work of Ricoeur, to me this is exciting. When I was in adolescence, I struggled a lot with self-esteem, and I ended up going to counseling just to help with self-knowledge and see what my issues were, that I would kind of be like a turtle who gets into his shell. I would play basketball and be afraid to shoot the ball, and if I made a mistake, I'd pout and get put on the bench, and it was really awful. In the throes of adolescence, it was really difficult. It was really awful. And so I was going to this counselor in town, and he had two paintings on the wall of his office. And I'm sitting in the chair telling him about all my problems. And he stops me and says, "See these two pictures on the wall? Which would you rather be in?" And one picture was very idyllic. It was this log cabin, very warm in the woods by a river, and it looked so peaceful, like the epitome of tranquility. And the other one was a storm. It was a field. It was dark and cloudy, and the wind you could see was blowing. And it was very like violent storm. And I looked at the two pictures, and right away I said, I'd rather be in that peaceful one. And he says, but I'd rather be in the other one. And I'll never forget him saying that. And he went on to say why. Because he says it's full of surprise, wonder, and adventure. There's something to respond to. There's a resistance that's happening that I have to perhaps fight against, defend myself or another. There's something that we have in a real adventure here. Like Gandalf talks about, come on this adventure. This is Paul Ricoeur. This is his philosophy, that he's not afraid to admit and to seek out the in medias res, the middle of everything, the busy intersection of phenomena crashing into the human subject. And this in medias res is the fold of interpretation. We have the given phenomena, but the subjective uptake of it. How am I interpreting this as I move to phenomenological description? And in turn, how am I responding to all this in terms of ethical action. So Ricoeur's philosophy, I would say, goes the distance even more so than Husserl, Heidegger, and Marion. It goes the ethical distance. Eventually, I want to share about Levinas, Emmanuel Levinas, too, after taking some time to talk about Ricoeur and his philosophy. Um, so, never at the beginning or the end. This is the dream of phenomenology, that we would arrive at the beginning, the most originary aspect of phenomenality in terms of givenness, meaning making, signification, the origin, what generates the whole encounter between the self and the phenomenon. Get at what is most original, what is most primordial concerning the phenomenon through this obsession with objectivity, going back to Husserl. But what Ricoeur is saying, that going back to Kant and reading phenomenology through Kant, that there's an objectivity to subjectivity we have to be just as mindful of. And so we're in medias res, in the middle of everything. We don't get at this enigmatic beginning of things. We only ever find ourselves in the middle. What William Desmond calls metaxis, this in between of philosophical thought. In medias res, never at the beginning or the end. And that's the truth for phenomenology. The project never comes to a conclusion. There's no period, only commas and ellipses. Dot, 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 dot. In medias res. So in Ricoeur's view, the original Sitz im Leben of a text, for example, that is authorial intention, original situation, original addressee, is displaced by a new Sitz im Leben of the reader that is characterized by the possibility of multiple interpretations and a variety of particular contexts for interpretation. So if we take a sacred text, for example, some kind of scripture, sacred text, it was written probably long ago, centuries ago. And how are we appropriating the text in the present? It depends a lot on the interstices of language, new contextual, cultural milieu. And so there's a displacement that occurs, and he calls it a distanciation, a process of distanciation. So in his book, Hermeneutics and the Human Sciences, Ricoeur writes that the concept of distanciation is the dialectical counterpart of the notion of belonging, in the sense that we belong to an historical tradition through a relation of distance, which oscillates between remoteness and proximity. To interpret is to render near what is far, temporally, geographically, culturally, spiritually. We have to come clean with this process of distanciation as an aspect of interpretation in doing phenomenology. We can't avoid the gauntlet. We can't circumvent the labyrinth. We must enter if the victory be won, if the prize be found of truth, of clarity, of precision, of honesty, intellectual honesty and responsibility for the whole, not just the prized part, the whole. And we already know from Marion, the whole is saturating, but we know from Ricoeur, to think toward the whole takes time. And this is something in our age that's very difficult. In a world of sound bites and summaries, uh, uh, we deal with these textual phenomena that are very fragmentary. And the philosopher cannot succumb to a fragmentation of thought in this new cultural context. But we have to do our homework. We have to invest the time in order to think toward the whole with honesty and responsibility. So, this is what Paul Ricoeur's philosophy teaches us to do. He's a great model for it. And it is the long route, and we could say the more difficult one. It is not easy, it doesn't come easy. But what is a value that comes easy? Isn't the most valuable things that come at a great cost? And the cost is the time we invest with the thinking. So, sitz im Leben of every phenomenon. In Kant, is synthesized with the correlating concept by the image producing imagination, while in Heidegger, a particular percept is wedded to a universal concept by the reflective ontological analytic Dasein. But in both cases, it is the human being who imagines, as in Kant's, and understands, as in Heidegger. In a word, it is the human being who interprets. So again, we have given phenomenon that comes as a living intuition for consciousness, but to understand it, to synthesize what's happening here, and to know it, to understand it, to make sense of it rationally, we have to interpret it. So Ricoeur's hermeneutical phenomenology is at least half of what's going on in lived experience, hermeneutics, interpretation. And again, Ricoeur, Heidegger, Marion are pressing to the givenness. Out of the three, Heidegger has the most attentiveness to the dynamics of interpretation and the interpreting agency of Dasein. But Ricoeur takes it farther, much farther than Heidegger. As Heidegger makes clear, no interpretation is made without presuppositions, without pre-understandings, or without pre-ontological projection. So these are the German concepts of Vorhabe, Vorsicht, and Vorgriff. Presuppositions, pre-understandings, pre-ontological projection. We have this in Heidegger. So Heidegger is very aware of the hermeneutical circle of interpretation and that point of departure there, that original point of reference. But this is not all. Heidegger goes on to posit discourse, Rede in German, as the articulation of the Verständlichkeit, intelligibility of the Da of Dasein. So, discourse, language, is the articulation of the intelligibility of the Da of Dasein, the there-ness of being there, the subjectivity being there, the phenomenon being there, being placed within a context of receptivity to givenness and this event of appropriation of the givenness, which is a hermeneutical moment in Heidegger. So discourse, Rede, is key. This is what Ricoeur is picking up on. And to go on, Heidegger says that the discourse articulating the intelligibility of the Da of Dasein makes understanding possible just because it lets something be seen as something through its pointing out. Language points out a thing in its particularity and allows us to understand it. So this is what is called in Heidegger the phenomenological as. This is key. So what we're doing here in studying Ricoeur is thinking how he moves with Heidegger into these hermeneutical concerns. In Husserl and Heidegger and Marion, we have an emphasis on the es gibt, the it gives, and looking for that phenomenological purity with Husserl, eidetic objectivity, with Marion, givenness itself as an absolute, the es gibt. But here, with the phenomenological as of Heidegger, and developed much more through Ricoeur, we don't just have es gibt, the concept of es gibt. What we have is es gibt als, in German, as. The phenomenological as. Heidegger's already pointing this out. But a phenomenon doesn't just give itself, and that is all. It gives itself as again, not what it is, but as how it gives. We're not asking about the whatness of the phenomenon, but rather the character of its givenness in terms of as this or that givenness, as this or that phenomenon, as, which implies interpretation. So the phenomenological as is developed through Heidegger and Ricoeur, not just es gibt, but es gibt als. It gives as something not just universal, but particular. So we continue to think with Ricoeur about this phenomenological as. In other words, language is what allows phenomena to become intelligible, to be understood. Language is the vehicle that brings phenomena to the light of understanding, copulating percepts with concepts. So the perceived phenomenon with an intelligible concept. To name the phenomenon through the act of interpretation, thereby rendering these percepts, these manifested phenomena, intelligible. In this sense, language is the incarnating and appropriating principle of manifestation, giving phenomena in the flesh, Leibhaftigkeit, to be understood as such. As such. Heidegger writes in Being and Time, whenever something is interpreted as something, the interpretation will be founded essentially upon a forehaving, a foresight, and a foreconception. Again, these German terms, Vorhabe, Vorsicht, Vorgriff. The interpretation is founded on that pre-understanding. An interpretation is never a presupposition lest apprehending of something as presented to us. So what Heidegger is getting at is try as we may to bracket the natural attitude, we never do so perfectly and absolutely. There's always a pre-understanding still involved in the human subject's receptivity of a phenomenon, that we can't get away from that. We can't bracket the natural attitude to the point that there is no interpreting subject. Otherwise, there's nothing exact to receive, nothing in turn to describe or respond to. So, interpretation, again, Heidegger says, is never a presuppositionless apprehending of something presented to us. So it's a paradox about bracketing the natural attitude, that a new natural attitude could replace the old one if we come with the assumption that we've bracketed the natural attitude completely. So again, it's a movement from this Husserlian naivete and a passion to bracket the natural attitude to the highest degree, radicalized through Marion, and an ultimate claim to this innocent, uncontaminated, unpolluted, perfectly purified subjectivity in relation to the purity of the phenomenological givenness. But Heidegger is saying that also it can be a form of the natural attitude, that we're assuming that we have done away with all assumptions. So there needs to be a redoubled bracketing of the natural attitude in phenomenology, again, to come clean with the truth about the intersection between phenomenon and subject, to come clean about this, so that we don't pretend that we have a kind of fundamentalist phenomenology at work, as if we've achieved the obliteration of the natural attitude and there's no hermeneutical point of departure. That's just not true. That's not true for any of us who are doing phenomenology. We bring so much hermeneutical, I'll say baggage, not just baggage, but filters to every lived experience. This is what Heidegger is exposing, unmasking, and this is what Ricoeur also is doing in his own work. So phenomena appear in the flesh, that Husserlian term, Leibhaftigkeit, in the flesh, insofar as they are disclosed by language. So again, to quote from Heidegger, Being in Time, section 34, the totality of significations of intelligibility is put into words. This is what we do when we philosophize. Inevitably, we put all of this lived experience, knowledge, and understanding into words. To significations, words accrue. Denn Bedeutungen wachsen Worte zu. And Heidegger says the way in which discourse gets expressed in language. Language is a totality of words, a totality in which discourse has a worldly being of its own. And as an entity within the world, this totality becomes something which we may come across as ready to hand. And in section 33 of Being in Time, Heidegger says that when considered philosophically, for example, the logos, the Greek term logos itself is an entity, and according to the orientation of ancient ontology, it is something present at hand for thought. It has a particularity. It has a being in the worldness as an entity. And so along with the formal structures of binding or synthesis and separating, diaresis, or more precisely, along with the unity of these, we should meet the phenomenon of the something as something. Etwas als etwas. This is the phenomenological as. We don't just have the givenness of something, but we have, through this process, interpretive process of understanding, the phenomenon as an etwas, as a something, als etwas, something as something. So we don't just have a cacophony of givenness that we can't assemble in knowledge and understanding. Going back to Kant, we do have these preconditions for possible understanding. This epistemological network of a symbolic order of meaning that's ready to receive new meanings and integrate them within this living whole of understanding. And so every phenomenon, if we come clean about the matter through Heidegger and Ricoeur, gives itself as something. Etwas als etwas, something as something. So we should meet this as a phenomenon. In accordance with this structure of understanding, something is understood with regard to something. So that's Kant's categories of relation, for example, these analogies of experience that we have to relate this new phenomenal appearing to other ones. And so then we understand the one from the other, and all of them within this network of relation. So we should receive things regarding something understood in relation to something else, something understood in relation to something as it gives itself, in such a way that this confrontation which understands. A confrontation of meaning. This is what Ricoeur calls a conflict of interpretations. That this confrontation which understands will at the same time take apart what has been taken together and will do so by articulating it interpretively. So it's beautiful in Heidegger, being in time. What he's saying there, he's getting at the importance of attending to the act of interpreting phenomena, not just receiving them. So yes, we receive phenomena in a kind of pure originary givenness, and what Husserl calls eidetic objectivity, but we receive them to the degree that we interpret them, to the degree then that we describe them and then say we understand them. And so it's this tug of war. That's why Heidegger calls it a confrontation which understands, because we have givenness and interpretation, and it's a tug of war because we don't want intentionality to outstrip intuition. On one hand, we don't want a takeover of interpretation, hijacking the phenomenon of its rights and privileges of its own self-giving. That would be a mistake. And that's what Marion is contesting. We don't want that to happen. We cannot let that happen. On the other hand, we can't claim such purity of givenness that we don't attend at all to the hermeneutical aspects of receiving that givenness. Because if we let ourselves be saturated by phenomena to this highest degree, we are rendered dumb and speechless, and just ecstatic mystics who fell into the abyss of saturation. And this also would be a problem for responsible thought. So there's a danger in the extremities of phenomenology. There's a danger too, in a bigger picture, of regarding phenomenology as sufficient by itself for philosophy. No. To think toward the whole means to have a, we could say, a polyphonic methodology, not just phenomenology, but existentialism, structuralism, classical metaphysics, analytic philosophy, everything. Gather it up, let it speak to each other, think toward the whole. Moreover, think in an interdisciplinary way, not just philosophy, but social and behavioral science, linguistics, literature, the arts, history, politics, music, theology, all of the above. It's difficult, yes. We can only do so much. We have to develop skills where we can read effectively, we can dialogue with an economy of words without falling into an exchange of sound bites and ideological opinions. So it's a difficult task, but if we begin with the disposition of listening, as Ricoeur suggests, we're already on the right track. And if we abide in that disposition of listening. So just a couple more points for this live stream. Ricoeur through Heidegger here. So this process of interpretation happens through language. Language is totality of words, this interpreting the something as something. And so this process of interpretation does not happen in an atemporal realm or an ahistorical realm of abstraction, but in time and history. Here's a quote from a great book called The Hermeneutical Theory of Paul Ricoeur. The author, last name Clem, first name David E. Clem, The Hermeneutical Theory of Paul Ricoeur, Constructive Analysis, 1983 book. Very helpful to understand Paul Ricoeur. So a quote from Clem's book, he writes, in interpreting Heidegger, first, temporality, time, is both meaning, the meaning of being and of Dasein, and also that in which the as structure of understanding and interpretation is grounded. So what is time? Or better put, in phenomenology, what gives time? Or what are the givenness of the meaning of time? Temporality is both the meaning of the being of Dasein, the meaning of the being of Dasein, the interpreting subject. That's beautiful to think about, yes. Time is the meaning of the being of Dasein. It takes time to understand the self, and also that in which the as structure of understanding and interpretation is grounded. It takes time to interpret. Time is what we recognize as giving itself as the very ground and foundation of understanding and interpretation. So this is very interesting reading with Heidegger. It is time that allows for the ecstatic appearing of phenomena in and through language. Phenomena stand out to understanding insofar as they are articulated in language over the course of time. So part of the Umwelt for Heidegger is temporality itself. We interpret through the course of time, and the givenness of time, along with the givenness of the world, the givenness of being, allows for the gradual and progressive appearing of phenomena in and through language. So for Heidegger, as for Ricoeur, phenomena stand out to understanding insofar as they are articulated in language over the course of time. So this is an entry into Ricoeur, again, through Heidegger. It's very rich and thick phenomenology, and it's very exciting. It complicates the picture. This is why I call Ricoeur a thorn in the side of phenomenology, because he does not let us rest comfortable and complacent with the acquisition of phenomenological givenness. This is very important and needed to be done as a rejoinder to the reductionism of psychologism and relativism, but we don't want to drift into a fundamentalism of givenness either. That's its own kind of natural attitude, which does not result in the most intelligent understanding of the full picture. So we need hermeneutics. We need to come back to hermeneutics, again, without, though, subsuming givenness inside of hermeneutical tasks, as if givenness were a product of the interpreter. That's not precise either. So givenness is a function of the phenomenon, but interpretation is a function of the human subject. And we have the conciliation, the rapprochement of the two together that we call phenomenology. So to do phenomenology at this point in the 21st century involves us bringing together the best of both worlds, this phenomenology of manifestation that we see especially with Husserl, Heidegger, Marion, Merleau-Ponty, and Michel Henry, so many in this phenomenological tradition. But then also we have this hermeneutical phenomenology, or this I call it phenomenology of proclamation, in late Heidegger, and Hans-Georg Gadamer, Paul Ricoeur, Emmanuel Levinas, Jacques Derrida. We have these two lineages of phenomenology that we want to be mindful of and doing phenomenology today. So thank you, Imran, for this question. Could I compare the meaning of what gives itself in phenomena with the meaning of how and what gives itself? So the meaning of what gives itself in phenomena with the meaning of how what gives itself. So yes, what phenomenology is trying to gather up is meaning, the givenness of meaning. So phenomena mean, and we say there's meaning there. Again, it's implied that there's interpretation that's receiving the meaning as meaningful, as intelligible, as legible. So the meaning of what gives itself in phenomena is bound up with the how of the giving, the characteristics of the givenness. So we can't. The best we can do in this kind of distinction is what Marion talks about, the fold of givenness, where we have like givenness as such applicable in a universal way to all phenomena giving themselves, but also each particular phenomenon, the given. So we have the fold of givenness as on one side, givenness on the other side, the given along the horizon of givenness for Marion. How does Ricoeur avoid reducing the events of experience to repeatable objective encounters? This is a really interesting question to think about. So Ricoeur would never discount the Husserlian eidetic objectivity of givenness. But what he's doing is filling out the picture with attentiveness to the hermeneutical tasks of receiving the given phenomenon. And so it's not a reductionism to repeatable objective encounters for Ricoeur, but every encounter brings with it a new event of appropriation, a new eruption and unfolding of Ereignis, Heideggerian Ereignis, this event of appropriation. Even if we're dealing with what someone might think is the same phenomenon, it's a new experience every time. And so the experience unfolds new layers of interpretation, and it brings a novelty to the experience. So these are great questions to continue to think about. And again, I think what's most exciting in all of this is to combine forces with these different phenomenologists and to bring together the best of their respective insights, and then to do phenomenology in a way that is, I want to say, kaleidoscopic, in terms of we have a lot of different things we're synthesizing together, we're integrating together in this approach toward the whole of what we call reality, what we call things themselves. And there's also an eidetic objectivity to subjectivity. And we already are seeing this with Kant. But then Kant resurfaces in a phenomenological tenor through Heidegger and Ricoeur. And then in different ways with Levinas in the Kantian categorical imperative, reframed in terms of the call of the other and ethical responsibility for the other. So the more we relate all these thinkers together, the higher resolution of our thinking. So thank you for joining me today in this live stream on Paul Ricoeur as a thorn in the side of phenomenology. And for philosophy, that's actually a good thing. The thorn in the side does not allow us to become too elated, too self-assured or self-confident, but allows us to remain in medias res, in the middle of it all, where all the action is taking place, so that we might think toward the whole and pray from the heart and live as a witness. We'll see you on the next one.